All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event on financing livable spaces as part of the Climate Innovator Spotlight series. We are thrilled to have you here at this event. This event is co-hosted by three wonderful organizations at Yale: the Yale Center for Business and Environment, CBEY, the Tsai Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale, Tsai CITY, as well as the fairly newly formed Yale Center for Environmental Justice. My name is Ben Soltoff. I'm the Environmental Innovation Manager at CBEY and an Environmental Innovation Fellow at Tsai CITY. I have been working on this series throughout the semester. This is the first semester that we've done this series, and it's been an incredible series. This is an event on spaces. So before I give you a quick introduction of where this event came from, I want to acknowledge some of the land that we're on. Yale traditionally kind of acknowledges the people who've stewarded these lands and whose ancestral homeland that we're on. Yale itself is on the land of the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin speaking peoples, but we also have speakers who are on lands of the Wampanoag peoples and the Lenape peoples, among others. I think that this is a conversation on space and place, and where it came from was a conversation I had with our wonderful moderator, Namrita Kapoor, kind of thinking about a lot of issues that were going on simultaneously. The urgency of addressing climate change being one of them, another being conversations around equity and justice and kind of how to address systemic inequality and oppression, and also this continuing trend of impact investing and directing funds towards the causes where they can have the most impact and really make a difference and move the needle in creating change. And as we were thinking about where in the world are these trends coming together, kind of what is a way that we can think about these things coming into one area of focus that would lead to a coherent event, we started thinking about place and spaces, real estate, but more generally than real estate, kind of the places that people inhabit. And I think now that many of us are restricted in where we spend our time and how we spend our time, we're thinking in particular about our spaces and about where the spaces that we're living, where are the spaces that we work, and how do we get between those? Where do we live and enjoy ourselves? And how do those differ amongst different populations and different parts of society? What are some of the risks? What are some of the threats? And what are some of the inequalities? And what are the pathways to dealing with that? So that's where this event came from. And I'm so thrilled to have Namrita and our wonderful panelists with us. And so I'm going to turn it over to Namrita to get us started and to introduce our panel.
Great, thank you, Ben, and thanks for inviting me to moderate what I know will be a terrific conversation. As Ben alluded to, although the demographics of our spaces may be changing rapidly with the pandemic, as for example, less people commute and live in city centers, the quality and characteristics that we want our communities to embody are arguably still the same. We want healthy, resilient, and enjoyable places to work, live, and play for everyone. So how do we get there? And particularly, how might the strong growth impact in impact investing be a lever for creating these livable spaces? This is our topic today, and I'm thrilled to be joined by four pioneers in this space who will share their direct experience on opportunities to get there. So I've asked each one to start our conversation with briefly introducing themselves and their work, and then respond to this question. Describe how the challenges of our current environment, name your favorite challenge, pandemic, election transition, elevated racial divide, have created any silver linings, catalysts, or opportunities in your efforts and work. And I'm going to start with the money, if you will. Anna Blanding. Anna has had an impressive career on the investment side, including co-managing the $3.2 billion endowment of the Annie Casey Foundation, one of the pioneering foundations in the impact investment space. Anna?
Thank you, Namrita. It's so great to be here today and to talk about this topic of the intersect between finance and environment and equity and environmental justice. So I'm really happy to be here. My background, as Namrita said, well, first we'll start that I'm physically in New Haven, Connecticut currently. However, my beginnings were on a farm in Oklahoma. And so I think about that a lot. As I think about community and how to create community in space and greenery and things like that. I went to undergrad at Yale as well as to SOM in the small building days of SOM, and but I would say that my pre business school background was really in the fields of policy and philanthropy, and then post business school, as Namrita mentioned, I have been mostly in the endowment management space. So with the Annie Casey Foundation, first worked across there. So Casey is at the time about a $3 billion endowment, and they were one of the first institutions to carve out a portion of their corpus for impact investing. So they carved $150 million to focus on impact investment. So my first job at Casey was really straddling the impact investment side of the endowment as well as the private capital. So looking at private equity, VC, private real estate, natural resources. And then I began to move exclusively into the private capital portion of the endowment. From Casey, I went to Choate, which is a boarding school here in Connecticut, and also managed their endowment and worked kind of across some other asset classes as well. So I've always been thinking about this idea of how can you use capital to really create more equitable and create communities of opportunity where where opportunity is not limited to the zip code you happen to be born into. And so that's been, I think, the kind of theme of my work. And then most recently and currently, I actually work I'm Chief Investment Officer of an organization called Concorp, which stands for Connecticut Community Outreach Revitalization Project. And Concorp is the economic development arm of a nonprofit called CONCAT, which started by doing job training for unemployed and underemployed people in New Haven. And because CONCAT was so successful at really creating jobs in phlebotomy and medical billing and coding and culinary for individuals, but a few years ago, we decided that we wanted to not just have impact or the individual level, but really how do you have impact and dig deep into an ecosystem and a community? And so we started Concorp to really look at kind of this more explicit focus on wealth generation and wealth creation, really looking at real estate development. So Concorp, and I'll talk about it a little later on, has kind of a few tenets. One is a signature real estate development piece we're doing called CONCAT Place on Dixwell, which is an historic African-American section of New Haven, a mixed use kind of live, work, eat, play space. The second kind of arm of our work, we're doing some strategic real estate acquisition, as well as kind of looking at some gentrification issues and keeping things affordable in the community. And I think another leg of our work, we're doing a lot of business acquisition. So we started doing some cafes and a market for Yale students, as well as some other kind of market of food culinary business ideas in New Haven. And then the final piece is we're doing a lot of looking at an impact investment fund that will be focusing more exclusively on Black businesses and how do you help businesses scale and have capital. That's really been a response from COVID.
So is that what you would say is your sort of silver lining?
Yeah, so I think, thank you. So the silver lining, with I think that, 2020 has been this really unprecedented year, right? And this idea that I think what the pandemic showed is that there's, of course, this health pandemic, and COVID-19 really exposed the social determinants of health and how certain communities are impacted more than others. But we've also, I think it really unmasked this pandemic of poverty and racism. And how do we really, and so I think the opportunity here is that we see this unprecedented flow of capital from, SoftBank and Netflix and all of these kind of institutions that have kind of realized that there's a sense of urgency around how do you really invest in the community financially so that it's more resilient for the next pandemic or whatever recession, that communities will be able to be more resilient and have more equity, internalize the community so that they will not have to suffer so much during the next pandemic.
Oh, terrific. That's fascinating. Let's move on now to Brian. Brian combined a career in entrepreneurial ventures and mission-related work in the Peace Corps before pivoting during his time at SOM to the impact investment world, where he sought to leverage real estate as a vehicle to change communities and founded his current fund, Shift Capital. Brian, I'd love to hear about your silver lining. Oh, you're on mute. Oh, there you go. There you go.
Sorry about that.
All right.
So, you know, just to share, I guess, a little bit of background before I jump into Shift here. You know, as you know, I started off with kind of that entrepreneurial lens, with that nonprofit lens, went back to SOM, really thinking about impact investing, and at the same time did a real estate deal in Philadelphia, my kind of home city, that really opened up my eyes to how capital flows into neighborhoods. And, you know, really right out of SOM, you know, the kind of seeds of Shift started. And for us, you know, we're a B certified impact real estate group. There's a lot of similarities to what Anna's doing with what we're doing. We've primarily been using impact capital to date, but our mission is really to build more just neighborhoods. And we've taken a very place-based, comprehensive approach and really trying to think beyond the boundaries of the building. And, you know, we feel like the business case is that a stronger neighborhood is the smart business case, and it really is core to what we do. We have raised over $50 million. We own about 2 million square feet of space, almost specifically to 2 neighborhoods in Philadelphia, which are 2 of Philadelphia's poorest neighborhoods. One of the things that, you know, may layer into the conversation is that in that fund, we have 4 Philadelphia foundations that made their first impact investment out of their endowment into the fund. So, you know, as we talk about where the money is and where the capital is, you know, I think we need to have a robust discussion about, you know, about endowments in particular. But in addition to just being kind of real estate developers ourselves, you know, this is really, for us, has always been trying to usher in that new model of economic development. And again, to Anna's point, you know, how do you build up existing communities when, you know, neighborhoods change? And the gentrification word is obviously what comes to mind for most folks. But, you know, it is certainly a loaded word and has a lot of connotations. And for us, this is really about opportunities to build wealth and for neighborhoods to control some of the destiny of their neighborhood. And then to participate in that shaping. The silver lining for us has been, you know, I'll share it through an example. In Philadelphia, we really only have one real estate group of color that can handle large, complex real estate transactions. And a few years ago, tax legislation came across called opportunity zones, which created a tax loophole for capital gains to start to flow into underserved neighborhoods. And that, I think, started a conversation about the disparity in the real estate space, and where, you know, and who is really controlling a lot of real estate in cities. But I feel like, you know, COVID and the uprisings, I think, has just absolutely blown that conversation up. And it has created what I think is a lot more space for conversation around it. I don't think it's a simple answer. It's very different than the venture capital world where, you know, there's a lot of kind of failing quickly. Real estate takes a lot of time. You know, we have institutional banks that have traditionally had histories of redlining. So there's a lot of components to it. But, you know, just a quick example of where this is starting to pay off this morning, actually, LISC, a national CDFI, and NEF, a national equity fund, was partners with LISC, you know, just announced a $100 million fund focused on, you know, the next generation of minority-led affordable housing developers. And, you know, I think it's just the tip of the iceberg, and at least I hope it is, because I think we need more than that. But I think that's a huge silver lining that we're starting to see some hope with.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So fascinating. Wow. Breaking news even. So let's move to Jasmine. Now, Jasmine has had a really unique entry point into this space, with her career starting as an oral historian, of all things, at the 9/11 Tribute Museum. Tell us more, Jasmine, about how you leverage your background to catalyze this change in financing livable spaces, as well as potential opportunities our current environment presents.
Sure. Yeah. Who would have ever thought an oral historian would have gone into impact investing? Everyone who's listening, you can do it too. I think, my background as an oral historian serves me every day. I think I'll just give a little bit of color of what the oral history projects that I worked on were about. So I worked on the National 9/11 Memorial Museum. Many of the interviews that I documented and cataloged are on display. And then after that, I'm from Queens, so it was very, very close to my heart and my own experience. And then after that, I moved out west and continued working on oral histories, largely focused on the human experience and resilience of living in really challenging environments. So I was documenting what it's like for young, mostly Latinx youth to live in unincorporated neighborhoods in San Leandro, and an unincorporated neighborhood doesn't receive the same municipal services like trash collection, and documenting the experiences of young Black men in Oakland and what it's like to live, with all of the challenges of being young and Black in Oakland. So that really was about human experience, human resilience, and uncovered for me the importance of having spaces in cities that are free and accessible and provide an opportunity to relax, connect, and kind of just be, right? And cities are spaces where you have to pay for everything. So the spaces that I became most interested in were parks. And that's what brought me to the Yale School of Forestry and the environment, and eventually to an MBA at SOM, where I played a little bit more with kind of place-based investing, and then realized that part of what a successful, healthy, equitable, and sustainable city is a city that also has innovation and opportunity for new great ideas to form and seed. So that got me into impact investing in a way. So that's a little bit about me, and a little bit about how storytelling has informed my career. Just to answer the question about silver lining, first, I think we have to acknowledge that this year has been really challenging, and any silver lining is small in comparison to the tragedy that people suffer. But I think, from an impact investing standpoint, the silver lining would be there's a huge amount of attention and capital now flowing to underrepresented founders of color, and support for those founders as well. And then from a personal standpoint, I think the silver lining that I see is this redefinition of what it means to be essential, and a kind of restructuring of class in a way in our American society that, though we don't have formal caste systems, is so disparate in our experience. So I think it's been really incredible to finally acknowledge frontline workers, and also acknowledge supply chain workers and our farmers, right, for feeding us and kind of getting us through every day. So that's my silver lining.
Spoken like a true oral historian. Threading from the capital to sort of what's the narrative that's surrounding that capital, and how important that is. So rounding out our panel is Susie Rule. Susie brings a truly multifaceted background to the conversation, with degrees and direct experience in both law and public health. After spending 20 years suing the EPA, She then went to work at the EPA as Senior Counsel on Environmental Justice in the Obama administration. Tell us more about about your efforts now and what's your silver lining these days, with full deference to Jasmine's comment about that silver linings are sort of minor in the scheme of the challenges we're experiencing these days.
Right. Well, thank you, Namrita and Ben, for hosting this very, very, very timely discussion. And when I think of timeliness, I think I feel that some of the remarks out of this new opportunity that we have with the Biden administration, coming with Kamala Harris's remarks during her acceptance speech, when she said that Black women are the backbone of democracy but are overlooked. And that is the space that I'm finding myself now. Again, like you were saying, like I work with communities that were bearing the burden of pollution, disease, poverty, and crime for generations. And some of those same organizations that I've worked with for decades are still suffering from those same problems, despite the progress that we've made. So to have our first woman vice president recognize this, I think is very encouraging. Because we know the data which supports that. So right now, within the School of Medicine, within the Child Studies Center, and also with Elevate Policy Lab, our focus is actually on children and their caregivers, and looking at children from prenatal almost through adolescence, and looking at caregivers as mothers, as fathers, as grandparents, but those who are part of that family of taking care of those children. And the brilliance that's coming out of the group of people that I'm working with is this recognition that mental health is a huge challenge. And by providing mental health, especially for mothers as heads of households and thinking of their children, we really can start to disrupt poverty, and looking at as a new approach toward disrupting poverty, but also to advance social and economic mobility. And then with my coming on board in July of this year, to think of also environmental sustainability. And within a School of Medicine, the logic is that you think of the people. And there is this strong recognition that no matter what you're doing to help that individual, if you're not looking at that sense of place, you're not going to get to that well-being for the individual, for the family, and for the community. So I have this amazing opportunity to come in and really try to be integrating place and people. And I think this conversation is very interesting to me because we have that seesawing going back and forth. And some of my pitches later on in the presentation are going to be about that focus on the people. And so just real quickly, within what we're doing with the work that I'm doing with the Elevate Policy Lab and with the Child Studies Center, there's practice as well as policy. There's the recognition that doing things just theoretically, you're not going to get the evidence that you need to really evaluate your effectiveness. But at the same time, you want to be able to make sure that those policies are adapted. And so we have an exciting program that's designed to bring maternal mental health to the people where they are, where they live, through several different methodologies. One of them is a stress management class. One of them actually looks at seeking to develop readiness for jobs and job preparedness. And we're doing that in a number of states, scaling that from Connecticut to New York to Vermont to Kentucky to Washington, D.C. So a really broad swath of communities that we're working with. And what's, I think, different and distinctive about the work we're doing, and again, it fits nicely with knowing government so well, having sued them and then worked with them, is that we know that no matter how much money we have in the outside external to government body, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's impact investing, whatever, government has so much more. And so we're really working hard to make government work for the people. And that's something that's always been a struggle. But the good news is, I don't think that there's opposition to that goal. It's just, how do we do it? And I think that's why bringing in, again, the brilliance of people on this call, on this panel, who know how the financial systems work, but looking at it, what we now call triple bottom line justice, environmental health, economic justice, and bringing this expertise to bear so that we can then apply that to government to do its job as it is intended to do. So coming to the question of silver lining, my remarks, it's very nice, and I'm not surprised, very similar to what my fellow panelists have said, but I like to think of life almost in the punctuated equilibrium theory. I learned that from my my daughter's 8th grade biology class. But we have long periods of no progress and then some really exciting progress. And I think about the literal tectonic shifts that are coming to society because of COVID, because of our increased awareness of structural and institutional racism, because of the massive impacts of climate, whether it's fires or hurricanes or floods, that the hard way of saying a silver lining, and as has been said before, is that we really have exposed this absolute false dichotomy between the economy and health. And I battled that when I first started decades ago. I battled the dead body count approach decades ago, and now that's exactly what we have to prove. Dead people can't lie. And we know where the failures of our system are falling right now, and they're falling on the people who are serving us, whether it's the healthcare providers or the transportation or the food. And we have to take dramatic action now. We can no longer keep doing what we've been doing. And to me, I always think of it, the question is not so much what have we done, but have we done enough? And I think that right now, I look at impact investing, having left government, is really as a star that needs to be called upon to do even more. And I think this is a group where I'm literally preaching to the choir, because so much of what I think needs to be done across the board, it really isn't happening. And it starts with this question of who is going to get the resources from government, or who's going to get the resources from impact investing. And I can tell you that it is not the people who are living what we're trying to deal with. The money is going to the people who are helping those people try to live with their lives. And I think one of the shifts that I think that COVID and the anti-racism movement has taught us is that some of the smartest people in the world are those who've had to survive by working 3 jobs and being a single mother. And so I think it's the shift that we need to see is looking at who, digging deeper into the community, continuing to do the work we're doing, but doing more to reach those masses, that single mom who is suffering from depression, and how do we get her into the job force? I think it's also about what is the money used for? I think that's where I get into this seesaw between people and place. And it's great that we're doing the concrete, we're building things, but we need to be investing in the people who are living in those places. And that gets into that workforce preparedness of mental health and other physical health needs. And then I think also, this is my last pitch for the silver lining concept, is that that money's important, but what we really need from the impact investors who have shown what their value system is, to help us with policy change and to help us to confront some of those levers that by joining together, we can make an even greater impact.
Yeah, fantastic, Susie. In some ways, you made my job a whole lot easier. You kind of rounded out the comments from this introduction, the silver linings, and set us up well for the conversation. Ben reminded me that I had yet to introduce myself fully. I had the honor of being invited to this panel primarily because I have a background in impact investing as well, having helped create Root Capital, one of the early platforms of impact investing, as well as a traditional finance background. And now I work with not only Yale, teaching at Yale's sustainable finance class, as well as advising National Geographic on its impact investing strategy, as well as a few other philanthropists. And this point that you're making, Susie, about this sort of, there's this, what I have been calling the intersection of philanthropy and impact investing is a place where I personally have been focusing, because I feel that we haven't figured out how to calibrate that well and address some of the sort of basic need pieces that only philanthropy can really sort of address, and address them in a way that stimulates and creates the opportunity for impact investing to then be even more catalytic. And so that's one point I wanted to sort of, and I feel like you all touched on that a little bit in your introductions. And the other thing that you all touched upon, not surprisingly, is what we all talked about in our pre-conversation about the other sort of triumvirate of capital, policy, and culture. And all of our experiences have been that capital alone is a necessary component, but not sufficient. And that we really need the culture and the policy pieces also sitting side by side with it, and sometimes maybe even more important, to help really catalyze that change. And so that'll be sort of our transition into Q&A. And before I pose the question for all of you, I want to let the audience know that following this question that I'll be asking, it'll be the audience's chance to ask questions. So start thinking about your questions, and feel free to start typing them into the chat, and we'll be collecting them and asking them after I do the introductory question. So with that, I wanted to talk a little bit more about these three factors of capital, policy, and culture, and hear more about your experiences in navigating these three factors. And this time I'm going to start with Jasmine, because in some ways you kind of kicked off this discussion when we had our pre-call, when you talked about how Sustained VC had a renewable energy investment sector versus an equality of empowerment investment sector, which one seemed very sort of prescribed and narrow to me, and one seemed much more systems oriented, which is, I think, where we're trying to get to. So I wanted to hear more, particularly about that equality of empowerment investment sector, and or another example that works for you about how you navigate these three factors of capital, policy, and culture.
Yeah, so I am very aware that I didn't even introduce that I work for Sustained VC. So hi, everyone. And one of the managing partners is attending. So hi, Tom. Sustained VC is a $27 million, well, we're a firm that has a $27 million fund that makes impact investments. And we do have a multi-thematic fund. We invest in the environment and sustainability. We also invest in education and health. And then we have a vertical called equality and empowerment, and Amrita, like you said. So how do I balance or think about capital, policy, and culture all sort of intermingling in our investments? I think the best way to talk about that is actually to talk about an investment that I'm most excited about as sort of like an emblem of the equality and empowerment vertical, which was one of the first investments that I participated in. It's in a company called Ultranauts, and they're a service quality assurance company that essentially can look at websites and pick up sort of like discrepancies. So they do quality analytics for websites, and they employ people who are neurodiverse, so people who are on the autism and Asperger's spectrum, and almost 90% of their workforce is neurodiverse. So that might not seem like I'm going to answer this question, but what is really unique about them is they are creating a culture, a workforce culture that allows people to have access and to be themselves and to show up fully for their work. And not only do they have 90% neurodiverse employment, but they're mostly a fully remote workforce. So this happened way before COVID, way before we all figured out how to do Zoom. They are employing people all over the country, and they have very, very high retention and satisfaction with their employees, which I don't know, if we can all say the same in our own transition to Zoom and being fully virtual. So what I think is really interesting about this investment and sort of the opportunity of Sustained VC to participate in investing in a company like this is we're providing capital to a company that is supporting an underserved population, right, in the US, and whose model for a remote workforce and remote employees will serve as a model undoubtedly for other Americans and other jobs, especially as we sort of bridge what it means to be working from home and fully online. So there is a shift in culture that's happening right now, and that microcosm that's happening with Ultranauts is a great example of sort of how capital can amplify their success in this cultural shift.
Well, and it sounds also like, I mean, gosh, that 90%, did you say 90%?
Yeah, almost 90.
I mean, that's fantastic. And it sounds like that's like an amazing, whatever they're doing needs to be then cross-fertilized back to other types of employment platforms.
Yeah,
I mean, what employer would not like to have that type of retention, right?
Yeah.
So that's fantastic.
Great.
And and this is me being naive or not educated. Neurodiverse is a new term for me. Say more about what does that mean to be neurodiverse?
Sure. So people who do not have a mental disability are called neurotypical. And I'm going to say disability in quotes, right? Because that is subjective in some ways. So folks who are neurodiverse may have autism, fall on the Asperger's spectrum, ADHD, you know, any host of sort of learning disabilities also, I think, falls within the neurodiversity encampment. But usually when you say it, it refers to people on the autism Asperger's.
I see. Okay. Okay. That's helpful. And in terms of like, when things come to you, when investment opportunities come to you in this equality of empowerment space, like how did you find Alternauts? How do you find the types of deals that fit in this space for you?
Yeah. The other folks who have been doing this longer than I have on Sustain VC have created incredible networks and pipelines of colleagues, and we all share deals. So through that, through pitch events all over the country and sometimes all over the world. So it's really great to support pitch events that uplift, you know, underserved founders, like I was saying. I hear about companies through LinkedIn. People reach out to me, and then also just kind of through different universities. So folks have reached out to me from Yale, Princeton, which is my undergrad. So.
Now, one of the things I've heard a lot the other thing I forgot to mention, my background is I'm also an angel investor. And one of the things I hear a lot from the people in that community that are also looking for sort of underserved populations to invest in is that a lot of times those founders are held to a higher standard or sort of asked more difficult questions than someone who's sort of fits into more of a mainstream view of a founder. And I'm wondering how Sustain VC approaches that issue to sort of, this kind of gets to that culture piece too, right? You know, so it's one thing to say you want to be in this space, but there's sort of another piece to sort of really create that environment that those types of founders and the types of business models are sort of on level footing with other deals, if you will.
Yeah, so the discussion of implicit bias is one that we've had in the firm many times, and I think one that, especially with the press that the BLM movement has gotten in the last year, has been sort of more front of mind. So we do talk about implicit bias and sort of the subconscious biases that we have as all people, I have them, about wanting to support people who look like us and maybe doubting others who don't, right? For fear of difference or unfamiliarity. So one way that we're trying to address implicit bias is to really call it out, to discuss it, but also to create a criteria of screening our investments and our founders that is just more transparent, so that we aren't leaning as much on a gut feel, which is subjective and invites sort of those subconscious biases. But to have like a more formal checklist that can spur discussion and that we can challenge each other on.
Right, great, that's helpful. Brian, when we did our prep call, you began your response noting that it wasn't clear if capital alone was making a difference and that the space really lacks a coordinated approach. Say more about that.
I did it again. There we go. Yeah, so when we started Shift, there really was there was not that many place-based real estate groups out there. And in fact, if you were to probably think about it, you would probably think of a group like the Related Companies that's doing Hudson Yards, massive amounts of capital in one place. And the reason that was the case, because when we looked around and said, okay, what does the impact space look like? It was really policy that was driving the impact investing space on the real estate side. So what I mean is that there really are only a few tools available for private developers or even nonprofit developers to do place-based work. There's the new market tax credit structure. There's a low-income housing tax credit structure. And then there's the CDFI network. And the challenge with both the two tax credits is that they incentivize developers to chase developer fees. And what happens is in addition to that, it gets spread around a city. It gets spread around a state. So what, a bright, shiny building comes in the middle of a economically challenged neighborhood, and you've got 50 people who can move into it. And someone writes that application and says, this is going to be a catalyst for change in this neighborhood. But then that developer is literally incentivized to go to another neighborhood and do it again, or another city or state. And so, our approach was to say, we want to invest in that catalytic project. It might use tax credits, it might not. But then we want to invest all around that project. And really go as deep as can be. But what we've learned over 10 years of doing this, that it's really, really challenging. It's very difficult, and there is not enough kind of policy level that's getting beyond scratching the surface of these tax credits. And so, yes, one part of it is capital, but another part of it is, aligning the other type of collective capital input. So in our case, we believe that we basically have a canvas in which all of these other things that need to apply to a neighborhood, whether it's health, whether it's related, whether it's small business related, whether it's services in the community, whether it's telehealth services to those single mothers who maybe can't afford to take off time to go to the doctor. All of these things need to be layered onto place. But we've got a couple challenges. And I think one of them is that we need to focus more on how policy is currently affecting the real estate space and figure out a way to make it incentivize more developers to be more concentrated with their work, so that government can get on board so that philanthropy can get on board, because we're, my opinion, as concentrated as we are, all of these groups are all scattershot with what they're doing. Every single one. Cities are scattershot with where they're putting their dollars. Philanthropy scattershot where they're putting their dollars. And there's no formalized way in which all this is working together. And to just bring in the third point of culture, I think there's two pieces of this culture that I think are worth mentioning. One is, I think, the real estate culture as a whole. Real estate culture is predominantly a multi-generational, white, male-dominated industry, and I recognize that I fit the bill. And the problem, though, is that there's a disconnect from the communities themselves, right? As a result of that. Yeah. So there's a culture shift that needs to happen within the real estate space, and then there's a culture shift happening within neighborhoods. I think that neighborhoods are way more sophisticated. I mean, Philadelphia, I feel like we have the most sophisticated, neighborhoods and community members in the country, and they will call BS, in a heartbeat. And it's a fantastic shift because, I'm starting to see them actually feel kind of empowered in a way that probably wasn't there before. But there's, one, still not enough levers for them, I would say. And then two, I think that there needs to be a lot more conversation around, what is the end goal when we're talking about uplifting a existing neighborhood? What does mixed income communities mean? What is good and what is bad? I mean, there's a report by the Philadelphia Fed that came out talking about how, actually displacement as it relates to gentrification is a lot more overstated than people realize. But the flip side of it is that it's more than just physical displacement, it's cultural displacement. And there's other fears that drive people. And so how as members of that kind of joint effort, can we get to better common language to talk about how to uplift communities? And I don't think we're there yet. We have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, who should be holding this common language? How do we create this coordination? I think you're absolutely right. And I'm just wondering, how do we get there from here?
I think that the philanthropic world actually has a playbook of collective impact that they have, has been kind of coming out the last 15 years, concentrating on a single, a goal of maybe a health impact or recidivism, impact. And, really crossing across the boundaries of nonprofits to tackle that. I think we need that type of quarterbacking across private, public, everybody who's involved in place. I mean, I think, you'll get to Anna, but, I think Concorp is an example of a group that is probably, there's not a whole lot of them across the country that are really trying to drive the conversation across multiple levels. And it's very hard to do it from the private sector only. One, because as authentic as we can be, we will always be the capital markets to neighborhoods, and that has baggage with it. And we have to own that and recognize that. So I do think, it probably needs to come specifically probably from the government side, from the philanthropic side, or groups that are doing what Anna's group is doing as well, to really drive a conversation across the sectors. They can talk to the private side on one side, they can talk to the neighborhood on the other, they can talk to city officials, and really start to drive those conversations.
Well, since you hearkened on Anna, let's move to Anna. Anna, tell me, how do you think about this? Are you ready for the charge? So Brian says that you're going to be one of the key quarterback in this process.
That's
and I think you're up to it.
That's great. No, I think I really agree. And just to kind of take a high level approach first, it's that, the impact investment field, right, or industry writ large has really had this, this transformation. I think, in the past 10, 15 years, it's become, more mainstream. However, what you often see, and I'm actually on a board of a foundation, an investment committee that also does, impact investments, and we're really mindful of that. But one thing we realize is that, so oftentimes in the private capital world, let's say the VC world, 98% of dollars, right, flow to Silicon Valley, New York, Boston. And as Brian mentioned, it's often very, white male-led VC firms that get an outsized amount of capital, even though we have a lot of data that shows that, non-white male-led firms actually are having really great, returns. So I think that, so this idea even that Jasmine mentioned, this idea about, how do you kind of move? So oftentimes impact investment has really replicated a lot of traditional venture capital, where it's going to kind of very New York or the coast kind of based big funds that are having definitely double bottom line. But really this idea about, is it really impacting, is wealth really being created and generated for the communities themselves? So I think there's this need right now to move, so impact investing is a great step, but how do you move beyond impact investments to really look at, can you source deals? Are there investable ideas inherent in communities? I think the answer is yes. And, you have a lot of foundations. I think Heron is doing a great job at this, right? They've moved from, impact, putting all their investments into impact investments. And now they're looking at, okay, how can we actually become more, embedded in communities and really look at non-traditional ways of investing in communities, not just a big super fund. And so I think that's kind of a, the high level view of that. Getting back down to what I'm working on with Concorp, it's, and it's true that you really, so Concorp is a, as I mentioned, we're an economic development arm of a very reputable nonprofit called CONCAT that had a decade of, job training and being really best in class in New Haven and in Connecticut, also with youth camps and things like that. And so because we had so much, gravitas and credibility in the community, I think then forming Concorp, this real estate development arm, has kind of, we've been able to make a lot of progress because there's been such relationship with, elected officials, but yet community. And there's very few organizations that really can kind of, straddle all those various players. And so just to kind of give some a better example of what I'm, working on with Concorp. So if you, so the Dixwellville, New Hallville neighborhood of New Haven. So let's say so as far as the mental picture, if you're, for people that know Yale on the call, if you're, let's say, facing the Yale bookstore or the Apple store, or let's say if you start going west towards Payne Whitney Gym or the Popeyes. So if you go a few blocks west of that, that's called the New Hallville Dixwell section of New Haven. And it's a historic African-American section in New Haven that is filled with just rich history of jazz and business innovation in life, and just really a lot of kind of innovation and community. I think over the past maybe, many years, but definitely kind of more excited over the past several decades, there's been this divestment of capital, both financial, but also cultural and social capital as well, where you really have a setup where you kind of have a few blocks from Yale. It really is kind of like two different New Havens, and various different outcomes, various resources that are embedded within that. So we decided that we wanted to dig deep into this community and really focus on how do we not exploit the community, not come in with a savior mentality, but how do you kind of harness this rich culture that's already there? And then how do you overlay and kind of, enmesh actual investment of capital? So what we're doing right now, we have there's an 8-acre tract of land in the Dixwell New Hallville. It was an old strip mall. And we've gone through the process. It's the largest developable tract of land in New Haven. And we've gone through the process of buying, looking at acquiring the site. And then we're going to raise the physical buildings, but really have this, but I think keeping a lot of the cultural amenities there. I will say that our approach has been, we're calling it restorative economic development. This idea that, and I say restorative because a lot of times economic development, while great intention, as my colleagues have said, you can kind of swoop into a neighborhood, you do this big flashy building, you swoop out with yourself, your money, your profits, your returns, your things like that. And it's really something that, and then it's not anything there. Restorative community development, while a slower process, it's really about how can we create something that the community themselves have identified that they need. So for example, we had, before we developed, we're now, and we've done the master planning, we're now in the actual, beginning the permitting and things like that process. But prior to that, we spent, we spent several years listening to the community. And the community said they needed food. It was a food desert. So looking at food, looking at, lack of affordable daycare, looking at also lack of, kind of commercialization and business development, also, housing needs, and things like that. So everything that we're designing on this space really is kind of a response to the community. And I will say that with that being said, there's some things that I think have a stronger financial ROI, like they pencil out easier than others. But we're developing this like probably $200 or $180 million mixed use real estate development. That will be about 180 units of multifamily housing at various rates of affordability. There will also be a new daycare center that will have 100 slots of affordable quality daycare. There will also be a grocery store or market, as well as a food hall, so more like an Italy type style. We'll also then have we'll also have office buildings and business incubation space, as well as performing arts center and space for community to gather. And so much of our project has really been around how do we kind of enhance the community. So for example, this community has a rich history of gathering and vibrancy, and they have a parade, the Freddie Fixer Parade. And so we wanted this new development to really build on that, where it's accessible to all types of people, where it's not that, okay, if you've been living here for 50, 60 years, this development is a fortress and you don't feel either physically or psychologically welcome. And so we're looking at how can we have it be, so that there's a lot of focus on really the human lived experience of our space. And so I think this idea about, find capital is important. We have, we're lucky that we have a really strong impact investor that has backed a lot of the work and has allowed a lot of the acquisition and things like that. And the model we are using for our financial capital is that we're having it be regenerative. So let's say we're having it's actually a pretty neat partnership between the impact investor, us, as well as our local community foundation. It's like a venture fund, a social venture fund. So therefore, profits from the project will actually be recycled back in the community. So it's non-extractive at all. And it's really about how do you build more wealth in the community writ large, but also at an individual level as well. And so, but I would say that, so the capital pieces we're doing is very creative and great, but the cultural piece is really important. How do you actually build a space where people feel that they can, live and enjoy and things like that. And we also have a pretty large sustainability piece that we're focusing on, energy as well as waste and carbon, but it's really packaged in this human experience, in the lived felt experience.
I want to bring you in here, Susie, because this reminds me a lot of some comments that you made before in our prep call about preparedness and, sort of what are so one is that sort of physical structure, but what's sort of what needs to be in the fabric? What's the scaffolding around the structure, if you will? It sounds like what both Anna and Brian have been focusing on and using sort of place-based investing focus. Tell us how you think about this from the health perspective and broader.
Well, it's interesting. I love being at the tail end to be able to hear everyone's comments and everybody's ideas. And I'm taking massive notes, and I have all my different colored pens that I'm marking up. And where do I start? But maybe I'll start with this, because I really am speaking to things that the others have said. From the environmental justice, from the triple bottom line justice approach, one factor that we really haven't talked about, which is we flipped the script, and that is the notion of contaminated sites, which are the source of physical, human health challenges. They're the source of blightedness, lack of tax rolls, so on and so forth. And by introducing that, I think that there's an opportunity to really build on what y'all have been saying. I think even Brian, when you were talking about the tax credits and it being scattered shot, the concept that I'm so proud of, because it was really built from the base of the communities in need, is called brownfields to health fields. And that's the notion of transforming contaminated sites from a Superfund site to a brownfields to a vacant property into something that's going to help those people who live in that area. And the most important part, and we call it B2H for short, the two is the engagement of those people living there to make those decisions. And it literally started back in the 90s in the South. And I know geographically things are different in terms of density between the South and the Northeast, but B2H is now nationwide. We're doing it in Bridgeport in an exciting way. But the long story short, it came about when environmental justice was just coming to fruition with its executive order. Brownfields funding was just being coalesced at the state and federal levels. And I was representing communities that we were suing, EPA and other polluters. And I asked them what they wanted from this combined effort. And they said they wanted their friends to stop dying at the bus stop, because they were having to get on a bus when they were having a stroke or cardiac arrest to get to the hospital. And we came together with this concept of let's all work together. We got an abandoned gas station, turned that into a community health clinic. now that concept has gone from one community to dozens throughout the state of Florida. When I got to EPA, we decided to take it to scale. We started by applying it in Appalachia. In Central Appalachia, 1 in 10 individuals are legally blind. We were able to get health centers and remediated gas stations. In Southern Appalachia, we were reforming and rehabbing abandoned high school buildings into multi-purpose facilities providing mental health. We connected in Houston with Hurricane Harvey and created B2H natural disaster to look at the flooding and combining that with the community gardens and access to food. Out in Southern California and Los Angeles, we were getting $2 million to redo a borrow pit into a park. So it's a concept that really has taken off. It's not a government program, but it involves very in a very close way, your local government, your private sector, your developers, the communities, and it really has been highly successful. And to touch upon, I love Namrita, I love your framing of, and maybe I'll give you credit for it, but I love this capital, culture, and policy, because with this concept, it is a fundamentally that cultural change from the community's perspective. It's the communities know what they need, they know how to get what they need. They just need some help in getting that, to work with them. And so that involved that cultural shift. And from the capital perspective, interestingly, where we are today with B2H is we're really drawing in dollars from across the federal family, 17 departments, with some of our projects have had U.S. Department of Agriculture funding, to Health and Human Services funding, to HUD with CDBG funding, to Department of Transportation, to FEMA with their natural disaster funding. So we're cobbling, it's not one check, but we're bringing it all together, and it's just highly successful. The gap is we don't have a lot of income investment, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But what I wanted to say in terms of policy, it is phenomenal what this little baby effort down in Clearwater, Florida in the 90s started. But we basically gotten B2H recognized by EPA. Look at their website, they've got a storyboard. We got the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice, Rural Communities Committee, to adopt it as a methodology. And that's how we've been doing our work in Appalachia and other rural areas. You now have, and this might go back to some of the things, I think, another point that I think you made, Brian, about literacy. One of the promising programs of EPA in the last couple of years has actually been dealing with the contaminated sites and looking not just at remediation, but also redevelopment, starting with the people who are impacted and reverse engineering that solution. But literacy, environmental literacy, health literacy, financial literacy was front and center about how we really need to work on that. So we've seen some policy changes there. And on top of it all, we have the BUILD Act now, which expanded the ability of the funding to go to 501c3 organizations. So I think that B2H is a great model. It's been highly successful. Right now with Elevate, we're applying it in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where we're working in the poorest of the neighborhoods with the most amazing community leaders to take land owned by the city that's being made available to the community and turn that into a hydroponic campus, to put in container farms for urban agriculture. All the while, we're also working with them on the maternal mental health piece. So I think that there's, if we combine all that we're talking about and connect the dots and then do a little bit of shaving off the rough edges, I think we have some really exciting models, because what B2H brings is that it's EJ led, it's EJ driven. And so, and you have people who are prepared to play ball in an arena that investment people play in. So yeah. I think it's a real positive opportunity to start putting these worlds together.
It sounds like you've got another powerful quarterback there, Brian. She's cobbling together resources from all over the place.
Yeah.
And
I've got my notes.
Right. And I hear a lot of oral history being woven throughout all this conversation, Jasmine. So clearly, this is an important part of sort of getting to the solution, is really sort of understanding what's the narrative of these places.
Yeah, and also,
please go ahead.
No, but I mean, there's just a common themes that I hear kind of coming throughout, and a lot of it does go back to listening to who you're most trying to serve, right? Who the end beneficiary is.
Right.
And really acknowledging that the people that you're trying to benefit are most knowledgeable about their own needs and their desires. And something that I just want to add, and maybe this is just too obvious to point out, but what I think is really great about sort of the impact investing that I do, which is, capital to companies, early stage companies. But what each Anna, Brian, and Susie, you do is that with each investment we make, we're trying to create a case study that success is possible to do investing in a better way, right? And create these models that can be replicable. So, I gave the example of Ultranauts, but it is possible to be a conduit of capital towards sort of like investments that create a future that we want, right? And that's the whole point of impact investing. So I mean, maybe that's just really obvious. I just hearing everyone's projects just as it makes it so apparent that we're each trying to build models for the future that we want.
Yeah, no, well said. I'm glad you articulated that. And so now it's the audience's turn to ask questions. Ben, do you want to set us up for the first question?
Yeah, happy to do that. I've loved listening to this discussion, and I'm just so inspired by all the work that our panelists are doing. It's incredible. I want to combine two of the audience questions because I think they actually fit together quite nicely. They're about trade-offs. So, when you think about the different investments and projects that you're working on, how do you manage trade-offs? In terms of impact investing, there's the trade-off between impact and returns. Is it always a win-win, or do you have to sometimes sacrifice one for the other? But also when you're thinking about impacts, as we've been talking about, there's so many different goals to have in terms of impacts, in terms of social, environmental, and which stakeholders are being affected. So how do you balance the trade-offs between those different forms of impact as well?
Who would like to start?
Well, I probably am least qualified to say anything about it. So, Anne, if you want to go, I had an idea, but if you want to go first.
Myself. I think that there is this, and also I think it's actually sometimes a false dichotomy, this idea around, return and impact. Because I think oftentimes our horizon is very short. So I think sometimes when you're looking at it in a quarterly way, let's say you want to kind of beat the market, things like that. Yeah, I think there are some times where impact investments can, underperform, like I said, on the numbers. But when you look at this idea, and I think we talked about it earlier, the world we're in, why we've had such, explosion this year as far as uprisings, right? But also as far as just physical, just death, is because I think the capital system as is really not, sustainable when you have such inequities. Because so I think in order to, so this idea about trade-offs, I think oftentimes that's couched in a very short time horizon, as opposed to what's actually a longer time horizon and creating a more equitable world where, let's say, everyone is educated, where you have a trained workforce in any neighborhood, not just, let's say, a very wealthy town and things like that. So but just kind of getting to, so I'll say that as a first stab at it. But also, there's, so I'm giving some examples. I've been in many impact investment funds, whether at the Casey Foundation. I'm at a foundation now that I'm on the board on, the Grosty Memorial Fund, and we're actually moving more to impact investments. And we've actually not seen any decrease in our return. So I'm thinking, for example, I can think of many impact funds. DBL is one of them, with our great friend, Nancy Fund, where during the recession, when the rest of the portfolio was kind of tanking, DBL was sitting there, getting some really high marks. So I think that, as we move on into our evolution of impact investing, we'll see that it's actually just really smart investing. It's not impact per se. And I think great companies that want to be around for the long term realize that they actually have to be, have those tenets as well in their makeup.
Can I also just add so the, Sustain VC, we hold impact and the return equally when we're looking at deals, but there is a sector of impact investing that is concessionary, right? Because they want to acknowledge that the impact for them and their partners and investors can outweigh the return. So that, that's just one example of a fund or a whole sector of this micro sector that is making that trade-off pretty overtly for good reason.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all.
I'll just plug, I think this is also just a question of risk, right? So we're just not having honest enough conversations about the right type of risk capital for, in our case, and not to make this about real estate, but when we were raising dollars, and I think there was a question about our returns, and we were, kind of targeting mid-teen returns, mid to high teen returns. And, I had a hardcore real estate person come down and take a look at where we were investing. And we have an average median income of $22,000. We are the opioid capital of the East Coast, one of our neighborhoods that we're investing in. And, they said, look, if we're not getting 40% returns, then this doesn't work. Now, if I'm out in the world and saying, hey, I'm going to deliver mid-teen, high teen returns in the real estate sector, that's fantastic. But the overall, in my opinion, the overall impact world is still not able to regulate for the amount of risk that I think really our capital needs to be taking. It needs to really lean into this and stop saying that they want their cake and they want their returns to their impact returns to. It may be true in some cases, and there's some phenomenal stories. And I think in the VC world, there's great cases where it just completely aligns, and that's great. But the place where we need capital is actually the place that's a lot messier. It's a lot more complicated. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, are these dollars going to gentrify this neighborhood? Well, possibly yes, but the alternative of not doing anything in a neighborhood where people are dying on the street just doesn't seem like a plausible response either. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, I just think that this whole concept of risk is in that trade-off conversation, and just we all need to go deeper with it.
I want to interject with my own story about this from my time at Root Capital. Starbucks had just announced that they were investing $10 million from their corpus in Root Capital, and it was the treasurer, hence, that announced this. And then Prudential, who had invested a few years earlier, turned to the Starbucks guy and said, I don't like the fact that we're subsidizing Starbucks. And then Rockefeller Foundation, that it's invested even earlier than Prudential, turned to Prudential and said, I don't like the fact that we're subsidizing Prudential. And I turned to them and I said, why on earth not? This is a wonderful thing you've done, Rockefeller. You unlocked our first private sector investor, Prudential. And Prudential, what a fantastic thing that you've done. You've unlocked this tenfold investment from one of the corporate players in the space. And so to your point about risk, it's like, well, there are many types of impact in some ways. So there's the direct impact for the farming families that Root Capital finances, but then there's also this impact in terms of opening up markets and opening up the capital and helping it flow. And we need players along that whole spectrum. And if they all think that they're only the most risk averse, who's going to play that early risk mitigation piece that really opens up these markets?
And now, Rita, I think that's where philanthropy is critical, because often I sometimes look at philanthropic organizations almost like the I don't know, let's say the venture of certain ideas, right? Being able to really, a lot of times foundations don't have such high hurdles for their return. And so they can actually go in very early with kind of more, I'd say, untested or very, as Brian would say, things that are deemed riskier, and can actually maybe have that either true grant making or very kind of below market returns, which actually is then able to kind of, really put a foundation for other more traditional players, to come in line as well. And then also, I think even sometimes within projects, like say our project at Concorp, we have a multi, couple $100 million project, and there's various return components within each type. So housing has a return profile, whereas certain things like the Performing Arts Center and some of the like daycare is really more, really subsidized because it's really something a community needs. That's a great point.
Yeah, absolutely. Ben, what's our next question?
Throw in
oh, I'm sorry, Susie, go for it.
Two thoughts that may be random, but one of them is the notion of full cost accounting. And looking again at triple bottom line justice, and think of triple bottom line justice not only as a negative, but as a positive. And I think that there's a lot of cash flow that could come into the equation if we all work together to access the resources that are lying in the banks of the federal government. The U.S. Department of Agricultural Rural Development leaves $2 billion a year on the table because they can't get it out the door. And it's because the communities that are intended beneficiaries do not have the capacity to be eligible recipients. I could give you heartbreaking stories of where the conditions are so dire over decades. And I think that I don't know a lot about the calculations for the direct risk that you're talking about, but if the formula was opened up a little bit, even thinking of some guarantees that could be provided by the federal government. But I think that we have an excuse for not doing it before, but now we have no more excuse than not making federal government work for us.
That's
and
right.
I think that but the communities need your help. That's where it goes back to the brilliant people I'm working with in Bridgeport would very much benefit to have some access to expertise in the financial world. We've got USDA potential funding, we've got HHS potential funding, but putting together that basic business plan, it's not rocket science, but we need some help with that. So I think there's a lot that people can do that's a light lift.
Great. Ben, what's our next question?
Yeah, to ask our next question, I'm actually going to turn it over to Lucy McEwen, the student coordinator from Yale College, who's been doing a ton of work behind the scenes to put this event on.
I'm super excited to work with all of you guys on this panel. So our next question is about kind of the natural tension between the need for human connection and trust within communities, which is often a really slow moving process, and then also the simultaneous need for making an impact at scale. So could you guys talk about how you think we might be able to achieve both?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Susie, I wonder if you might be best to start this off.
It's interesting, and I think it goes back to where we have a lot to work with right now. As I mentioned before, this recognition that the piecemeal approach, that an attitude, for example, in redevelopment that says, let's just get the property cleaned up, but not think about what it might become, gives us a space to start addressing some of those things. And I think from the environmental justice world, where traditionally we don't have a lot of money or a lot of political power, but time is money. And so I think that investment at the front end of sitting down at the table where there's gunshots out the door, sitting at the table where you can't drink the water because it's so polluted, but going into that space and starting these conversations and really looking at the people who are impacted as community developers, not in that traditional sense, we call them the EJ developers, but there is a huge interest across the country in environmental justice community leaders wanting to be playing a role in this. And I think that when you invest that time in the front end with that trust, then the progress is going to be very, very exponentially faster.
So go slow in the front to be fast in the back end. Right.
Yeah, and I think going back to the first B2H example is that the biggest battle a lot of times is how clean is clean. And because the community was brought to the table to say, well, what do you want on this site? Not only did that decision-making process just race through, but the highest level of cleanup was achieved because all of the money saved and not having to go to court on that cleanup standard. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we can access. And I think that the community leaders themselves are very much interested in trying to have some of these conversations, which again will be saving time to have the better investment of the dollars and into something that's going to help their community.
I'll add, I think it's a fantastic question. And I think when we were first getting started talking about doing this place-based kind of approach, we got, in fact, I'll share, we sat down with the Yale Endowment and pitched them, and we were first fund, and they said, look, come back to us when you're not your first fund and you're willing to put out $100 million or more. Mm-hmm. And immediately the idea is, okay, how do we scale? Like, how do we get to that level? And I think we have to decide, and we have to figure out where we can scale and where we got to stop talking about scale. Like, neighborhoods are so different. Mm-hmm. And if we are trying to plug in some scale, like immediately scalable model, then we're just going back to the $1 billion fund, kind of a ivory white tower concept. And the reality is, if we're going to do what, I think we're talking about on this panel, which is empower and build wealth and all those things, it's inherently not, it may be it might be scalable in the way Susie's brought up, like in frameworks, right? But we have to be careful about like business models that scale quickly, and business models that scale quickly, I think immediately, because this is why the question is so good, inherently some red flags should go up, mm-hmm. right? Like, because it's not that easy to talk to communities and talk to people on the ground and to build that trust and get to know who they are and get to listen to what their needs are. So it's just, it is the rub. I think it's like we could spend a whole panel talking about that, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Oh, go ahead, Anna, please.
Yeah, I know with the work with the Concat and Concorp, I can't say how many times we are approached to say, can you bring this to XYZ city, right? And this idea about, replicating and scale being framed as replication, as opposed to, I think we're really looking at scale as in, scaling the depth of impact we're making. And that's how we've really reframed that. So it's been that we've actually, like I said, the work we're doing, it's actually hyper local, not just local, but hyper local, in the sense that it's a neighborhood in New Haven, which is already a small town. So, but we realize that in order to actually transform a community and transform lives and, transform, I guess, like recreating the idea of what's possible if you're, in a community, it takes a lot of, as I mentioned, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of conversation, it takes a lot of just actual physical time being there, where you have a credibility that's built. I will also say that the team I'm privileged to work with is it's 5 of the most impressive, amazing people I've ever met. It's, I'm on the team. There's a former entrepreneur. There's an amazing nonprofit executive. And so there's a former banker. And so we just happen to all be on this team, but it's really hard to replicate that. And having this, so I think even more than the capital, financial capital, is how can you actually, replicate leadership and being able to be in different communities. So I completely agree with Brian's view about, I think, oftentimes there's this view about everything in the social impact space has to have its carbon copy in the traditional space. And oftentimes, there's many times they don't translate. And so I think when you're really looking at really transforming the life cycle of a community, where people actually, where let's say a child born now, in 20 years from now, they have, there is no racial wealth gap, there is no education gap, things like that. That takes a lot of years. And so we've actually approached this idea about, being committed to being deep in a community over the long term, not just a year, not just a quarter, mm-hmm. not just a financial report time, but really about being there for the years. And I think that's why we've been able to build so much trust and get so much done, because we've actually had about probably 10 years of pre-work and relationship building and things like that.
It's back to the basics of relationship banking in many ways, I think, are the models that all of you are approaching this with. So this is a fascinating conversation. I'm just worried a little bit about time. So, because we've got 5 minutes left, and I want to give each of you a chance to sort of do a wrap-up comment, as well as a call for action. Coming out of today's conversation, what's one thing either that you would like to see happen, or that you would like the audience to focus on. So Susie, I keep on ending with you, so why don't I start with you this time? So any wrap-up comments and what your call to action would be?
I'll be really brief, and I just want to thank you for setting this up. I think it's been a fantastic conversation, and I've learned so much. And to get very pragmatic, I think the first point is I think you really hit on the key issues and challenges that are important in community-based, community-driven redevelopment from the capital culture as well as policy. But I think in terms of a call to action within the Elevate Policy Lab and the Child Study Center, we're trying to do a wraparound effort. Our action is a model executive order that is going to focus on the beneficiaries that we talked about, the children and their caregivers, their mental and their physical health. But it's really modeled after the executive order on environmental justice, which is really expecting cross-agency action. Every 17 departments should be doing something about person or place in that respect. And so I put that out as a call to actions. We would love to have engagement, love to have ideas, love to have some introduction of the financing world into this, because it is about leveraging the federal dollars. And then I think my last point would be to really hope that we can take the global macro work that's being done and take it down even more to some of those really small baby steps, and knowing the value of some things that are very routine to you in your world. And I guess maybe part of that is to think about the other SOM at Yale, not the School of Management, the School of Medicine, because I'm working with a bunch of great clinicians and researchers who are working with me on the model executive order, and they're also doing place-based work. So my call to action would be to join with us as we're trying to save the world and reshape society while we're doing it.
Excellent. Jasmine, why don't we move to you? You still there? I don't have it on the screen. There you are.
Yeah, I mean, wrap up thoughts. I don't know. It's just always humbling to be on a panel with such great people doing such great work. And I can only imagine the other great work all of the other sort of participants and people watching are doing. I don't think I have anything honestly very profound to say as a wrap up. I just think something that's really stood out to me in this conversation is, and other panels that I've attended and sort of been on, has been that we really elevate the role of the investor. And what I've heard most strongly in this panel is the need for capacity builders. And so I guess my call to action for those in the audience is, if your path isn't as an investor, or you're not doing investing, but you are one of those capacity builders, you're just as essential, and we need your expertise to create this world, right? So please do the good work, and if you know of any amazing companies, please send them my way.
Well said. And I'll give Anna and then Brian the last call. Last one.
Thanks. I think this has been an amazing conversation, and just I think all the thoughts that have come forth. I would say that my last thoughts is really around that it's past time for us to really reimagine communities. And I would say that oftentimes we have a view that, and it's very well intended, right? But this idea of we want to kind of save a community, but really looking at an asset framework of a community, and making sure that in our development and in our whatever we're doing, that the community is sharing in the development and wealth creation that's happening. And so really reimagining communities, not as dependent and needing help, but how can we actually partner with communities to, I think, help themselves, or maybe bring out the assets that are already there. So I think of it almost like a painter who's kind of uncovering some of the beauty of a community. So I would say that's the first thing, call to action, is just kind of being aware of a lot of our own implicit biases that we have with certain neighborhoods and certain communities. And the second thing I would say, you know, we're always, of course, looking for, you know, people for partnerships and things like that. So definitely if there's people that have thoughts about the work we're doing in New Haven, would love to have follow-up conversations.
Great, and bring us home, Brian. So a very livable home.
I can't, I'm not going to be able to bring it home after these incredible panelists. You know, I'll say, you know, ditto for us. You know, we are call to action, I guess, on one hand, which is a little bit more self-serving for us, is that we are, you know, in the midst of creating a new fund to focus on Black and brown developers across the country. And so, and trying to lift them up along the way. So whoever's out there, if you know, if you have any ideas for us, open to that. I second. You know, I really do believe that it's going to take a village. And so, you know, in whatever way folks out there, you know, are interested in, you know, creating that layered approach to this work, you know, we're interested. And, you know, finally, I just would say, you know, this is, you know, this incredible network, incredible people, both on the panel, probably here as well. And, you know, I think we just need to continue to push the envelope on, you know, finance strategies, finance as a whole. It really needs us to really think through where capitalism is failing. And, you know, I'm excited to have participated. This is an amazing group of people, and thanks for bringing us together.
Well, thank you. And I'll just do the final word and paraphrase Anna. I liked her comment about, let's make impact investing just about smart investing. All investing should really be sort of thinking about impact to it. And with that, I want to thank you all for not only participating in the panel, but for all the important work you do. You truly are pioneers in this space. And without these examples of innovation that are occurring in all your efforts, we're not going to get there. So I really appreciate not only your time today, but all your efforts moving forward. And thanks to everyone who were able to join us. And we look forward to being in touch for the next conversation in the series.
Thank you so much, Namrita. Thank you, everyone. Just going to throw in some CBEY research before we wrap up. Also want to thank all of our co-sponsors, CBEY, Tsai CITY, and also the Center for Environmental Justice. They're so new, they don't even have a website if you were Googling them. So I threw an email in there for how to get in touch with them, because they're a really exciting center at the Yale School of the Environment, building on great work. We'll be doing more Climate Innovator Spotlight talks in the next semester, so stay tuned for that. You may have heard in this talk, climate didn't come up a lot as a focus, which was by design. A lot of the important work of building spaces that are climate resilient and that address other environmental challenges don't necessarily start with climate, and that's totally okay. That was a big focus of and reason for why we had this conversation. So thanks again to Namrita for her wonderful skills as a moderator. Thanks to our panelists, and thank you everyone who joined. Have a wonderful evening.